these are the sentences of Peter Lombard. And if you look at the text, you can just see this is some dense stuff, right? This is just very intense, dense reasoning. And it was the job of the teachers at the University of Paris to explain this to the students. Don't even try to read it. It's very dense, very intense Latin text that just goes through the reasoning that explains the theology. But this was the new theology, basically, at the time. It was an Aristotelian logical approach to studying and teaching and proving Catholic theology. The teachers at the University of Paris, like Albert the Great, they took that text, and what we have here, you can see these little quotes. These are quotes of the text from the sentences. You can see them in here. And then you have his expositions. But what I wanted to show everyone was the exposition, when you look at it, how they taught the sentences is with the format of the Summa Theologica. So that was the teaching method at the University of Paris by which the teachers explained the sentences of Peter Lombard, okay? So what I want you to see is that the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas, which we're going to get into, St. Thomas didn't come up with that. That wasn't something that he sat down with a blank sheet of paper and just decided, oh, you know what I should do? I think I should have a question and then present some objections and then write a response. The Summa Theologica isn't this idea that St. Thomas had. It was a method of teaching that was already in practice in the university before the Summa Theologica was ever composed. Okay, so it's got a history to it. It's a method of teaching. St. Albert the Great is teaching the sentences of Peter Lombard here using that format of the question, the objections, the response, the replies to the objections, and so on. So here, this is his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. Later on, St. Albert the Great, here's another work of St. Albert the Great. You can see the work that he actually wrote is called the Summa Theologia. So Albert the Great wrote his own Summa Theologia before St. Thomas. And if we look at the Summa Theologia of Albert the Great here, get down to the questions. I'm sorry for scrolling. When we get down to the text, we can see it looks exactly like Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which we're going to look at in a minute. So all that I want you to see is that before St. Thomas wrote the Summa Theologica, this method of teaching was already in place. St. Thomas Aquinas didn't invent the Summa Theologica out of nowhere. It was already established by the teachers at the University of Paris, and St. Albert the Great already wrote a Summa Theologia. So the format was established as a method of teaching at the time to explain the Catholic faith. But this was a new idea. This was a radical new idea. So we go from this, the writing of St. Albert the Great, to the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. And this should be familiar now because it's already been in place at the University of Paris before that. And like I said, I don't know if you saw this before, but this was a letter from 1271 written at the University of Paris, and it contained a list of books that were required for the study of theology. And we see that all it was books of the sacred scriptures and the sentences of Peter Lombard. So that was the theological curriculum. And that was exactly when St. Thomas was at the University of Paris for his second teaching tenure. So that's what St. Thomas was teaching. He was teaching and commenting on and explaining the books of the sentences of Peter Lombard, and he was doing it by means of the format that we see in the Summa Theologica, okay? The content is almost the same as St. Albert the Great's. If we look at St. Albert the Great's, the first question St. Albert the Great asks is whether theology is a science. That's the first question in St. Albert's Summa Theologia. When we go to St. Thomas's, we see his second question here, whether theology is a science. It's the same content. So what we want to understand is what's different about St. Thomas's Summa Theologica. Why in the world did he go through all the work of writing an entire separate Summa when St. Albert the Great had already done that? And this is what I think is surprising for most people. If we back up in the Summa Theologica, if we back up, we find that St. Thomas wrote a prologue. And this is what, as I said, I think this is what surprises people today, because what's happened to the Summa Theologica is because we just get so little theological teaching and study. We think that the Summa Theologica is like the crown that sits upon the top of, Mount Seminary. And if you go through years of seminary or go through graduate school of theology, maybe you'll get to study the Summa Theologica, because it's for like the super theology experts. But we find that when St. Thomas wrote the Summa Theologica, he says exactly the opposite. And I want to read this prologue here. He wrote, "Because the master or the teacher of Catholic truth ought not only to teach the proficient, but also to instruct beginners, we purpose in this book, the Summa Theologica, to treat of whatever belongs to the Christian religion in such a way as may tend to the instruction of beginners." So the Summa Theologica was not intended to be this book reserved for the theology students, or reserved for, the seminary upperclassmen. St. Thomas wrote the Summa Theologica intending it to be simple enough to be used for the instruction of beginners. That's why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, when I introduce students to it when they're in like middle school, and people think that that's crazy, it's the stated purpose of the Summa Theologica to be intended to instruct beginners. And when you learn to read the Summa Theologica, the content of it really isn't any more complicated than the content of the Baltimore Catechism or the modern church catechism. The content is not difficult. It's just the structure is unfamiliar, and many people balk at the structure because it looks strange and think there must be some kind of mystery to it, but there's not. So I want you all to see this. I want you to see that the Summa Theologica was intended by St. Thomas to be a source of instruction for beginners. And so, we're not doing anything crazy by digging into this and studying it and talking about it together. Even if we just consider ourselves all beginners, we're all qualified for the Summa Theologica. And so that's what I wanted to show you. And the other thing that's important is he explains the purpose of his Summa. Down here at the bottom, he says, endeavoring to avoid the faults that were made by other teachers back in his time, he says, we shall try, by God's help, to set forth whatever is included in the sacred science as briefly and as clearly as the matter itself may allow. So in St. Thomas Aquinas' mind, the Summa Theologica was the briefest and clearest presentation that he could give of Catholic theology, and he believed that it was perfectly acceptable to be used for the instruction of beginners in theology. So I think we should be encouraged to enter upon the study of the Summa and not expect it to be too difficult. But primarily what St. Thomas did was he made it brief and clear, and that's really what a Summa is. So when we see Summa Theologica, it's an attempt to explain the faith, to explain theology in the briefest and clearest manner possible. That's the purpose of the Summa Theologica. Now, having said that, when we get into it, it's this gigantic work. It's this, book, the first part has 119 separate parts in it in terms of investigations, and that's just part 1 of 4. So it's a massive work, yet at the same time, it's everything we need to know about the Catholic faith taught in the briefest and clearest manner possible. So what I want to do tonight is just go over the format of the Summa and make sure everyone here understands how it works, and show you how you can use it really in everyday life, because it really becomes a very simple resource to use and very practical. So That's what I'd like to walk through. What we see, if we scroll back up a minute, bear with my scrolling. This is the table of contents for part 1. And we can see, you don't need to read this, just I'll tell you what it says. But in part 1, we can see the topic is God himself. The topics are the existence of God, the simplicity of God, the perfection of God, the goodness of God. It goes through all these different attributes of God, and is just simply an exposition of the character, the attributes and existence of God. That's part 1. Those are the main topics of the first part. When we go down into it and we look at one of those topics, here's the first topic, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. We find that each topic is then broken down into a number of questions or articles that need to be investigated. So in order to address this topic, St. Thomas lists 10 questions that we need to answer. And then he goes about each of those questions. So the first question listed here is whether divine science or whether sacred science or theology is necessary. Is this necessary for us? That's the first question. And when we go down, we see in the first article, that's the question, whether, besides philosophy, any further doctrine is required. So do we even need to study theology, or why do we need to study theology? And then he goes into an investigation of that question, provides us with an answer and proof, and disproves false answers to that question. And that question at that point is resolved. And we move on to the second question in the second argument, or the second article through that topic. So that's how the whole book proceeds, just topically breaking it down into its elements, which we talked about last night, breaking it down into its parts, resolving all of those parts, and then reassembling the subject with all that knowledge. So if you were here last night, we talked about the process of studying philosophy. That same process is on display here in the Summa Theologica. We see the general topic, we see it broken into its elements, and then we're able to reassemble or synthesize it and understand the topic with what's called wisdom, right? That's what we explained last night. So that's the structure of how the Summa Theologica works. And this really isn't a big deal. Once we see that, it's not a big deal. What is really great about the Summa is that it's so easy to use and practical. So we're going to get there in a minute. I'm going to show you how to use it practically. But let's just walk through this first article. So St. Thomas asks whether beside philosophy any further doctrine is required. Now, let me just ask you, in the chat we'll do this. Let me just ask you, why would someone, based on what we've studied this week, if you've been here the other nights for this week, why might somebody think that we have everything we need in philosophy? Why might someone think that we have everything we need in philosophy? If there was an unbeliever who wasn't interested in studying theology and said, I think I've got everything I need just in studying philosophy, why might that be reasonable? What do you think? Anybody have any ideas on that? Why might someone think that philosophy is sufficient, provides us with everything we need? Any ideas? Any ideas? Just be brief. Any ideas on why philosophy might be sufficient? Sorry about that. Man, this is a busy night. There you go. Sorry about that. I had the chat off. Why might philosophy appear to be sufficient? Why might someone think philosophy might be sufficient? Any ideas? If you have no idea, write no, so I know you're not typing something. That's what I tell the kids to do during the day. No. Come on, Gene. Be clearer than that. The object is to be happy. The object is already addressed. Addressed how? By philosophy. It covers everything we can think about. Yeah, we talked about that this week. We said that Aristotle said that there were 3 different kinds of things that we needed to know. There were actually 4 different sciences, and they're all covered by philosophy. All of the sciences that he mentioned were provided for by philosophy. We have we have physics and metaphysics covering natural philosophy. We've got ethics covering moral philosophy. We've got logic covering rational philosophy. And then we've got mechanical art. So every relation that exists between reason and order that we talked about, they're all covered by philosophy. So why would there be any need for something else? That's the first question we need to ask, whether theology is necessary. And so St. Thomas in this first article takes on that question. So he asks whether besides philosophy, any further doctrine is required. Then you'll see these objections, and I don't know if you have experience with the Summa, so bear with me if you know this already, but you'll see he presents an objection. And an objection is a false answer. All right? A false answer. That's good, Benoit. We're going to get that in a second. That's very good. We're going to get there in just a second. He presents an objection, which is a false answer. And he gives the answer, and he gives some reasons why that answer appears to be possible, why that might be true. And he gives a second objection here, a second false answer with an argument for why it might be true. So two good answers that are not true. He presents them first. And then he introduces this phrase here, on the contrary. And the reason why he does this is to show that while these opinions appear to be reasonable, it seems that they contradict some authoritative source. And so what he does is he quotes sacred scripture, and he says, on the contrary, the scripture says, all scripture inspired of God is profitable to teach, reprove, correct, and instruct in justice. So he shows a passage of scripture, an authoritative source that appears to contradict those objections. The reason why he does this is part of the Socratic method, the older Socratic method, is because we've got people here with opinions on this topic, and they've got reasons, and they're pretty confident. And what he wants to do is introduce doubt into their minds. He wants them to second guess themselves. He wants them to pump the brakes and ask, wait a minute, maybe I'm wrong, because it really does look like what that scripture verse says may contradict what I think. So, on the contrary, presents an authoritative statement from some authoritative source that introduces doubt to the opponent. And that's part of the rhetorical purpose of the Socratic method, to lead someone to uncertainty or docility, right? Teachableness, because they actually doubt their own knowledge and opinion. So he introduces an authoritative source, and then he presents his answer. We see I answer that in italics there, and he gives the answer to the question. And it's just stated plainly. It was necessary for man's salvation that there should be a knowledge revealed by God besides philosophical science built up by human reason. That's the answer. So he gives his answer right up front, like a thesis statement, in an essay, and then he presents positive proof for his answer, for the right answer. He gives positive, usually demonstrative proof that his answer is correct. So we have the presentation of the objections or false opinions, an introduction of an authoritative source to bring doubt into the mind of the opponent, the presentation of his answer, positive demonstrative arguments for his answer, and then a return to refute the objections and prove them to be impossible. And that concludes the investigation of that article. And that process is followed for every single article, every single question in the Summa Theologica. And what it shows us is the method that he uses to not only teach what's true, but to prove false what is false. And because he says, we'll see this in the Summa Contra Gentiles, the purpose of a wise man, the duty of a wise man, is to cling to what's true and to prove false what is false. So the method of this scholastic disputation or instruction really is to present contrary views, introduce doubt to those who hold them, present the true position, give the demonstration for the true position, then go back and refute the objections. And that's the method of dealing with every single question in the Summa Theologica. And he just does that for every single article, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles all through the Summa. Now, for those of you who are parents with children, the reason why this is so important is because this is the method for essay writing. This is how to write a persuasive essay. I teach this to the kids in our meetings. St. Thomas shows us here, if you want to talk to your kids about this, St. Thomas shows us how to write persuasively and defeat an opponent in an argument. But he doesn't do what most kids are taught in modern schools. He doesn't just, ask the question, state his opinion, give his reasons, and then write a conclusion. There's another important step, which is to actually destroy the opposition. And usually, schools don't ask kids to do that because kids usually can't do it. But that's an important part of the process that I teach the kids to work on and practice. Identify, learn, research, study, and figure out what the opposing views are, prepare refutations for them, then establish your own thesis, present your positive evidence, then destroy the opposition. That's how you write a persuasive essay. So we have that model for us in the method of St. Thomas Aquinas. And like I said, he takes every controversial question and treats it in the same way all the way through the Summa. So that's the method he follows. And there's just hundreds and hundreds of questions that he goes through and teaches the faith. So that's the method, and I want you to see how simple that is. The other thing that I want to share with you here real quick, how can you use this practically? I don't know if I shared this the other night or if I shared it with the kids, because I taught this class to the kids a few days ago. But I have the entire Summa Theologica in one text file. This is how I study it. I have the entire Summa in one text file. I'll give you the link here. It's the entire Summa. What's great about this is you can find any topic very easily. So let's say somebody's bugging you about purgatory, and you want to know, what did St. Thomas have to say about purgatory? You can just open this file, use your keyboard, Control F, and search for purgatory, and find every single reference in the Summa to purgatory, and use that as a way to get started with a study. And you can do that for any topic, anytime. So it's very useful. Once you understand what St. Thomas is doing here, you can use it as a reference book. So there's two different things we can do with the Summa. We can study it article by article to learn all the content, which we should do, but we can also start using it immediately as a reference book. The only danger with using it as a reference book is that you have to remember the structure, because if you find arguments in the objections, you've got to remember that those are false arguments. And the reason why I warn you of that is because some of these objections, these arguments are really good arguments. I have to be careful, because when I'm listening to the Summa in an audio book format, I've got to make sure I pay attention, because you can read these objections, and if you don't know their objections, you might think that that's actually what St. Thomas is teaching, because these aren't dumb answers to these questions. These are really convincing arguments that, without St. Thomas's help, a lot of times you'd read that and say, that's actually what I believe. That's actually how I would answer this question. And now I need to go study what St. Thomas says, because I'm in trouble. I actually hold that false idea. You'll notice that quite a bit, because these are really great arguments, but the error in them is subtle, and it takes someone like St. Thomas to explain what's wrong with them. But as long as you know to beware of the objections and make sure you're getting your information from the part where St. Thomas actually answers the question, or from his replies to the objections where he argues against them, you can use this as a reference book, and it's very, very helpful like that, very useful like that. When people ask me theological questions, or I want to write an article or talk about something, the first thing I always do is just run through the Summa, do a keyword search, see what St. Thomas has to say, see if he's already addressed this issue in the Summa, and that's where I start getting ideas from, pulling quotes from, and stuff like that. It's just a very easy place to start, and everything is right there on that one page. And just so you know, when we get there, I've got the same thing for the whole Summa Contra Gentiles. The whole Summa Contra Gentiles in one text file, and you can do the same thing. You can just Control F on your keyboard, search the whole entire Summa Contra Gentiles, and use it for the same purpose. So both of these books, the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles, can be used as reference books, starting immediately, as long as you understand the structure. And then you can take your time to study through it, one question, one article at a time, because that's going to take a while. But you can immediately start to use it every day in the Catholic life to answer questions, research questions. Things come up, just questions about Bible readings, or something comes up in the news, a controversial topic. You can go to the Summa, run a keyword search, and find every place St. Thomas speaks of that issue. So it's just very practical to use. All right. With all that behind us, so hopefully, I know it was confusing because the screen share wasn't working, but what I wanted to show you, just first of all, and you can look into this yourself later, I wanted to show you that the Summa Theologica didn't come out of nowhere. St. Thomas didn't just sit down with blank paper and say, I've got an idea of how I can teach the faith. I'm going to do it like this. He was a student of St. Albert the Great. He likely learned from St. Albert the Great using this method, and he just made it better. That's what he did. He expanded on it, made it clearer, simplified it, made it briefer, more concise in places. He improved the Summa Theologica that St. Albert the Great had already developed, which was itself an exposition of the sentences of Peter Lombard. So there was a tradition that was already developing, and Thomas Aquinas is sort of at the end of that tradition, the perfecter of it, not the inventor of it. And then secondly, just to understand the structure of the Summa, how each question is investigated, pull one practical application out of that and realize that St. Thomas is showing us how to speak and write persuasively on a controversial question. So there's some good practical, examples of how to do things that we learn from St. Thomas. Then how to use it as a reference book. And then lastly, that we need to study through it, one question at a time, and learn the content of the Summa, which is what the kids do in the academy. What I have them do in the academy, just so you know this, let me just get into the course here real quick. What I have the kids do in the academy is we read one question in every lesson. So you can see lesson 1, part 1, question 1. The kids read the question, they study all the articles under that question, and then they have an assignment to do. And this is the assignment that they work on. So they do this for every single question. There's just 7 questions, and I ask them the same 7 questions in every single lesson. So they get used to the routine and then just focus on the content of the Summa. So I ask them to identify the question, and I encourage any of you who are interested to do this and complete these assignments because they're helpful. Identify the question studied. What is the subject that St. Thomas is investigating? Into how many articles does he divide this investigation? Then I ask them to list each article, so list each of those questions and give St. Thomas's answer to it. That doesn't mean they have to give me St. Thomas's arguments and all that. I just want, very simply, how does St. Thomas answer that question? So if he asks, is theology necessary? The answer is just a simple yes or no. Yeah, St. Thomas says that theology is necessary. So I want the kids to know the question for the article, and I want them to know St. Thomas's answer. Very simple. Then the next question is a little challenging. I ask the kids, what universals does St. Thomas reason from in proving his answers in this lesson? And I want to challenge you, if and when you read the Summa, I want to challenge you to work on this same question. What universals does St. Thomas reason from? What this means is, what principles, what sources does St. Thomas draw his answers from? And I don't mean sources like he quotes the scriptures or he quotes Aristotle. What you'll see when you read the Summa, and I'll show you an example, the question that we want to know, and we talked about this the other night, we have questions today to answer that need creative new answers. we have questions to answer today that St. Thomas didn't answer. I don't think St. Thomas wrote about transgenderism. I don't think St. Thomas wrote about democracy. I don't think St. Thomas wrote about nuclear weapons. So in modern society, we've got questions to answer that we can't look up in the Summa. What we've got to learn is how St. Thomas answered the questions, how he approached the questions, how he went about solving the problems, understand those principles, and then take those principles and start applying them to our own modern questions and come up with creative, intelligent answers to modern problems. We can't go to St. Thomas for those answers, and it's our responsibility in many of these different spheres to solve these problems ourselves. So what I ask the kids to do is to learn how St. Thomas answers these questions by looking for the principles that he starts with and reasons from to answer the question. So for example, the question for this first article was whether theology is necessary, whether anything other than philosophy is necessary. And when we start to read St. Thomas, we get to some of these principles. He says, first, because man is ordained to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. But more simply, St. Thomas starts with man is ordained to God. In other words, God is the end of man. That's how St. Thomas answers this question. So when you propose a question to St. Thomas, like, do we need to study theology? St. Thomas starts with a very simple principle. He just asks about the causes of man. And he says, well, what is the end of man? And you say, well, the end of man is to enjoy God forever, right? That's the end of man. Okay, well, what's necessary in order to fulfill that end? We need to know, love, and serve God. Well, how can you know God? Okay, now we're in trouble. How is it possible to know God when we learn by means of the senses and God is an invisible, bodiless spirit? So you can just see how reasoning from the principle that God is the end of man leads us to St. Thomas's answer. And that's what we learn by looking for what are called the universals or the principles that St. Thomas reasons from, because we can see how St. Thomas answers these questions, and we need to learn to imitate him in that. So when someone asks us a question, I see this with the kids all the time. If I ask them a question, they just start, who knows where, right? It's like chaos and randomness. And I've got kids who have memorized the Baltimore Catechism, and they don't think to start by thinking about what they learned in the catechism. They just start, well, I think that, you see how we've got to actually discipline ourselves that when we face a question or a dilemma, we've got to start with the principles and simply reason from the principles. So by focusing on them, looking for them, hunting for them, as we read St. Thomas, we start to put together a list of these principles, and we see that there's not a million of them. It's really a number of core doctrines that he always starts from, and he just starts reasoning with a chain of arguments from those simple basic principles down to the answers of specific questions. And it's really not that complicated. So I have the kids search the answers of St. Thomas and look for those universals that show his starting point. Obviously, there are some clues. Like he'll say since or because or for, and he's giving the reason for this next statement. So that reason is the important part. Even more important than the answer is the reason that he gives, because that's a principle that we can pull, and we can use that to answer 50 questions. So that's what I have the kids focus on, trying to understand how St. Thomas answers these questions. The next question I ask the kids is, what sources does St. Thomas appeal to for support? When we go through the Summa and we look at St. Thomas's writings, we see him quoting sources for support. We see 2 Timothy quoted up here. We see the prophet Isaiah quoted down here. St. Thomas studies sacred scripture. So what I tell the kids is, if you see the sources that St. Thomas argues from, that tells you what you should be reading and studying every day, because those are the sources of the Catholic faith. He quotes sacred scripture, he quotes the church fathers, and surprisingly, he quotes Aristotle all the time as demonstration for the Catholic faith. So I have the kids list, when they complete these assignments, I have them list all the sources that they come across as they read St. Thomas's arguments, and then I tell them, those are the sources that you should be studying. Those are the sources St. Thomas studied. Those are the sources that answered all these questions. And then at the end, I ask them to briefly summarize the content, and they do this for every single question in the Summa Theologica. So if you want some guidance for how to go about studying it, or you want some help where you can complete an assignment, write some answers, and submit it, there you go. The course provides this assignment for every one of the questions, and it challenges you to dig through the Summa, find St. Thomas's answer, look at the sources, the rational sources that he reasons from to come up with that answer, look at his sources that he uses, and then if you say, well, you have any books you recommend for me to read? Right there, that's what I recommend for you to read. And he's going to give you the list. It's sacred scripture, it's St. Augustine, it's Aristotle, and so on, a few others. But it provides us with a guide for the whole Catholic life. And in the end, we have this massive work to use as a reference book every day in our own Catholic life. So if you'd like a guide to study the Summa, I'd recommend you use these questions. I'll give you a link to this document. Just a second. But if you want a guide to study it, even if you just, make it a habit of taking notes when you study the Summa and using those questions to help you think about what to note, I think you'll find that helpful. And the kids do pretty well. It takes them a few lessons. In the first lessons, they're intimidated and they don't think they can do it. They struggle with question 5. That's the biggest difficulty. And if I didn't make them do that, they would probably never do it, which is why it's important. But after a few lessons, they get the hang of it. They know how to find the universals. They know what to look for. And then they just start zipping through the Summa. And it's really not that difficult of a course once you figure out how it works. So I think that's a good intro to the Summa. And we've used up about all the time that we have tonight. What I really wanted you to understand tonight, and I'm sorry if it seemed a little scatterbrained. I've got a lot to do this weekend that's kind of stressing me out. But I just wanted to make a couple points. First of all, the Summa didn't come out of nowhere, right? I think that's clear. You can see that there was a history of development, and St. Thomas is writing the Summa at the end of that development. That was the first thing. I wanted you to see where St. Thomas was in that history, and I wanted you to see from his prologue that he intended it to be for beginners, and he considered it to be as brief and clear a presentation of Catholic theology as was possible, so it's appropriate for us to study and get into. And then I wanted you to see the structure of how the individual articles are pursued. I wanted you to see how to use it as a reference book in your Christian life. And then I wanted to go through this set of questions so you'd have something as a guide to help you study it and not feel like you're just swimming in the ocean, but have some objectives to accomplish as you study it. All right. So having said all that, that's what I wanted to share tonight. So if there's anything in there that you'd like to talk about, I'm just going to turn the recording off here so we can get this offline, and we're free to chat and get into